Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, José Luis Granados Ceja, a Mexican-born journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer over at Venezuela Analysis, as well as host of their podcast as well. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Thanks very much, José Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States and Sentido Común here in Mexico. We got to kind of do a Simpsons different kind of opening each time.
Oh, right? The couch gag, okay.
Oh, you're right. Another episode of Soberanía.
Subtle. All right, I'm going to give you the rundown before we get started here. The first topic we'll be touching on is Mexicanos Contra la Corruption y la Impunidad, our old friends over there who are masquerading as journalists. And there's a bit of a scandal recently, last week, due to the fact that they are receiving a lot of money from the United States, from our friends at the National Endowment for Democracy. It's caused a bit of a diplomatic rift between the United States and Mexico, and so there's been a lot of fallout as a result of that. We're going to go back to the constitutional reforms and see where things are happening. The big one, the judicial reform, had a lot of advancements this last week, and it's good to revisit them. And of course, there were some other ones that I think are worthy of attention involving electricity, around fracking, around corn. So lots of stuff that's important to the Mexican population and something that's been in the headlines in the United States as well, and even in Canada when it comes to GMO corn. And then we're going to move on to this scandalous affair of Javier Corral, the former pan governor of Chihuahua, who is now with the Cuatro T as a member of the team of Claudia Sheinbaum's presidency-elect. And there was a bit of some unscrupulous behavior from the current governor there. It seems a bit of it's a case of political revenge using the law to go after her rivals. Where we heard that before. Seems to be more and more common these days, this lawfare. And of course, finally, the losers and haters, and somebody that I think many of our readers and listeners and viewers will know, Andrés Oppenheimer, writing the Merry Herald, more BS about Claudia Sheinbaum. And in fact, it's kind of like a rehash of an old one. You found the older piece. I'd be interesting to go through that and see how little has changed. These guys don't seem to update their analysis. So, all right, let's get started. And I think I'll hand it over to you, Kurt. Maybe you could fill us in terms of where did this story all start from? Who kind of brought it to light? Why has it become such an issue in Mexican media these days? And I'll put here on the screen the story from La Jornada, which is this group, Mexicanos Contra la Corruption, received 96 million pesos from the United States since 2018. So basically since López Obrador has been president. This was revealed by the Financial Intelligence Unit of the Attorney General's office, the Federal Attorney General's office. So that's a large amount of money. What are they doing with this money? Why does this matter? Why is López Obrador worked up about it? Fill us in, Kurt.
So, it goes right back to the title of this podcast, as so many things do, Soberanía, sovereignty. And it goes back to so many of the different and often subtle ways that the United States has to attempt to undermine countries' sovereignty. And this is one of them, right? So this has been a long-running story over the last several years. But what we found out last week really brings it back to the fore with more detail and more numbers. So last week, Pablo Gómez, who's the head of what's known as the Unidad de Investigación Financiera, the financial investigation unit of the federal government, comes out with a report on the financing of an organization euphemistically known as Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity. Sounds good, right? Sounds good to have an organization opposed to corruption and impunity. But, not surprisingly, the founder of this organization is none other than Claudio X González, who is the power behind the throne of Mexico's enfeebled, but still nominally present opposition coalition. Right? He's a junior. He's what's known as a junior in Mexico, kind of one of those fail sons. Kind of one of those ne'er-do-well sons of Claudio X's padre, who is the head of Kimberly Clark here in Mexico, the Kimberly Clark conglomerate, and a rabid AMLO hater, Claudio X González, father and son, right? So Claudia Gonzalez always says, well, I'm not part of it anymore, although he was a founder, right? And is still linked to the organization. Who became the head after him? Maria Amparo Casar, who we've talked about in this program, of receiving that stupendous fraudulent pension, right, that came out in the final weeks of the campaign, right, due to her husband's committing suicide, right, back 20 or so years ago, and they're attempting to claim otherwise, right, trying to cook the books on that. So these are kind of the savory figures, who are involved in this organization. This organization, is a hit organization. It's a hit organization. That's what it is, right? Now, they occasionally do some worthwhile investigations just to, cover their asses. Otherwise, it would be really blatantly obvious. But their job is a hit organization, right? It's an opposition hit organization. That's what it is. That's what it is. And what Pablo Gomez reveals is exactly how much of that money is coming from the United States of America, right? Through U.S. aid, through the National Endowment for Democracy, and channeled through the U.S. Embassy here in Mexico, right? As was discovered, this organization has a 500 million peso, has received 500 million pesos in donations since it was founded in 2015. 100 million of which, just about, came straight from the U.S. Embassy, so 20%.
Wow.
Which is already a lot. But when you factor in that the U.S. funding only began when AMLO won the election in 2018, and Morena got its congressional majority, right? So from 2018 onward, the percentage of U.S. financing of that organization is even higher, right? It's even higher in those 5 to 6 years now since the election, right?
Right.
Basically, the United States has been the main sponsor of this organization, right? The main sponsor of this organization.
And would it be right to say, by extension, in a sense, also a funder of the opposition? You just outlined the links between Claudia Gonzalez, the fact that he claims to have moved on, but is clearly still involved. He is the man, and we've discussed so many times on the show, behind the opposition. He is responsible for the forced marriage, the coalition, all of this. And it turns out his key organization, the way that he intervenes, is largely being funded by the tune of nearly 27 million US dollars. So converting that with the current exchange rate, that's an extraordinary amount of money to go. I mean, I can't imagine what an organization that, I was in control of could do with $27 million, right? A whole lot more than what they're doing. But I guess, you gotta pay Maria Amparo Casa really, really well because, according to her, she can't live without that kind of income or without her pension.
Right. That's right. When she sued to get her pension back, she said it would leave her in penury if they withdrew her pension, right? Not mentioning the fat salary, basically from the United States and from Channel 11, right? From the Mexican taxpayer there, right? And, her university stuff there. So, on and on. So you're absolutely right, José Luis. This is the United States directly paying the salaries of top opposition figures in Mexico, right? They can't hand them a check directly, so they go through these NGOs, that nominally fight corruption and promote democracy. And as we'll see in a moment, this is a worldwide formula for the United States. This is a worldwide interventionist formula of using NGOs masquerading as anti-corruption and pro-democracy crusaders to fund opposition groups within the country and promote U.S. interests. It's as naked as that, right? And it's not only the U.S. government. Who else from the United States has been funding MCCI, right, which is its acronym? Well, not surprisingly, you have the Ford Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
You have the MacArthur Foundation. You have the International Community Foundation, and you have the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, right? The usual suspects. Within Mexico, in American Express, on and on it goes. Within Mexico, you have Soriana Supermarkets. The Soriana Supermarket was involved in the 2012 purchasing of the election by those prepaid debit cards, that the
Right.
Enrique Peña Nieto campaign handed out. The Chedraui Foundation, the other main supermarket chain in this country. Grupo Pisa, the pharmaceutical group, right?
I mean,
And
that's pretty extraordinary. If I just want
yeah,
to pause on that for a second there.
sure.
So this organization, let's I know we can be kind of cynical and tongue in cheek about this organization, but yeah, let's take them at their word. They're dedicated against to fighting against corruption and impunity. Does it make sense to be funded by the largest business organizations in the country that are part and parcel of a long history of corruption and malfeasance and improprieties in this country? Can they really be said to be credible in their own stated mission when they're receiving funding from basically the Mexican ruling class that has been responsible for an institutionalized corruption that has existed for a very long time in this country? I would argue that no, it's not appropriate whatsoever. And if
Of course.
anything, it seems more like a effort at public relations to say, look at how good we are. We are also against corruption, even though we participate in it, allegedly. But we also fund the organization that's doing this. But ultimately, it's promoting class interests at the end of the day. Always follow
That's
the
right.
money, as you say, right?
It's an image laundering exercise, right, by the foundations, right, and institutions linked to ruling class interests. That's absolutely right, right? Now, of course, they'll always try to justify it and say, well, we have to take money from where it comes in order to be able to do good with it, right? Which is always very convenient. What they leave out from that equation is something else that Pablo Gomez mentioned in his exposition, that these, of course, are tax deductible contributions if you're a legally constituted Mexican organization, right? Like the foundations I just mentioned, right? So it's not only an image laundering exercise, it's a tax deductibility exercise, right? All of these major companies also always have a philanthropic wing and a foundation, an allied foundation that goes with it, right? So instead of paying taxes to the Mexican state, what they'll do is they'll channel money through their foundation and use it as tax write-offs, right? So it's image laundering and it's tax write-offs, right? And that's what's happening here, right? So part of the report included, this necessity, as AMLO pointed out, to revise the statutes governing tax deductibility for organizations legally constituted in Mexico for this reason, because it's absolutely abused.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
absolutely
they're taking money out of public coffers, right?
Yeah.
Deciding to allocate them privately, and then not offering no transparency when it comes to this. And I would say that that's a reply to the critics who say, how dare the Mexican government, using terms like dox people and reveal their salaries and reveal their funding. Well, no, there is a public interest in this. And I think it's entirely justified to say, hey, this is where this money that should be going in taxes doesn't, and is being used in these inappropriate ways, political ways, right? I mean, if you're a 501c3 in the United States, you're not allowed to do open political work the way that clearly Mexicanos Contra la Corruption does, and the links that it has to people like Claudia González, a very well-known opponent. I mean, they're definitely crossing lines here, and I don't think it's inappropriate, because there are a lot of people who really got worked up about that, saying, "Oh, how dare they? This is once again López Obrador, violating private citizens' interest." No, there is a public interest here, and I think it's entirely justified.
That's absolutely right. So when you put those pieces together, what you have is an entirely artificial organization, right? That has no, organic links to the Mexican public, although it claims to be fighting on their behalf, and is funded in large part by the United States government, by United States foundations, and by the Mexican ruling elite as a tax evasion exercise. That's what MCCI is.
Yeah.
That's what MCCI is, right? And that money goes to fund the opposition. And it's really, you don't have to look that hard, right? You only have to look at who the founder is, who the current president is, and what their political activities are. You can see them at the rallies. They don't hide. They're out there, right? I mean, Claudia González is known from border to border in this country as the opposition leader behind the throne. Mm-hmm. He's very bad at it, fortunately, but there he is. There he is.
Yeah.
Right. So what I'm saying is nobody in USAID, nobody in NED, and nobody in the embassy, Ken Salazar over there, can make the excuse that I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
They can't. Because it's so transparent. I mean, that the way of hiding it is just so thin, right? It's almost as if they were giving the check directly to the pre-PON coalition. They just route it through this, this shell organization, right? That doesn't even bother to hide the fact that their founder and president are open opposition leaders. That's how open this is in Mexico. And the fact that it's not known in the U.S. is a testament to how poor U.S. journalism on Mexico is. Because this should be the first thing that people should know.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And before we hear accusations of double standards here, I wanted to highlight this last quote here from Pablo Gomez, where he says, does receiving donations, is that not equivalent to giving a certain class of services under the supervision of foreign governments, like any other country, like the United States, which has the foreign registered foreign actors,
FODI,
lobbyists,
right?
basically.
Yeah.
Basically, like you're allowed to lobby and do work and try to influence public policy on behalf of a different government, but you have to do so under the auspices of the law there. And there are certain recommendations and restrictions around that. That's clearly not happening in this case. Nothing about this is out of the ordinary, but of course it's always made to seem like he's going after his critics, that he's an authoritarian, the usual line that we've dissected before. But before we move on from this topic, I wanted to bring in the international dimension. And you had this tweet here from last week saying, well, one day after that it's revealed that the United States is directly funding, the U.S. Embassy is funding Mexicanos Contra la Corruption. The Secretary of Foreign Relations of China came out with basically a report, a readout on their accusations when it comes to this kinds of policies. So what are the Chinese talking about when it comes to this? I was surprised to see that they mentioned Mexico explicitly. What is this this situation? What does this report from the Chinese Foreign Ministry tell us?
Well, this is very interesting because it shows the extent to which U.S. funding of these bogus organizations in the countries is an international issue, and that other countries are well aware of the dynamic, right? And it also shows the extent to which, of course, China's not holding back anymore and laying stuff out that they might have been a little bit more reticent to do in the past. So the Chinese foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs puts out this report called the National Endowment for Democracy, what it is and what it does. And what it says in the introduction is very clear. The National Endowment for Democracy, NED, acts as the U.S. government's white gloves. It has long engaged in subverting state power in other countries, meddling in other countries' internal affairs, inciting division and confrontation, misleading public opinion, and conducting ideological infiltration, all under the pretext of promoting democracy. Let's recall that National Endowment for Democracy was set up in the Reagan 80s, right, as part of this new generation of U.S. agencies designed very specifically to do more overtly what the CIA had previously done covertly. It was actually kind of a brilliant strategy. If you bring it right out in the open, all of a sudden it becomes, less objectionable, right? Or at least seemingly so, because we're not hiding it, right? And of course, you have a pliant media that justifies it, all the better, right? So its innumerable evil deeds, it says, have caused grave harm and drawn strong condemnation from the international community. And it goes on to say, in recent years, NED has kept changing tactics and gone even further and acting against the historical trend of peace, development, and win-win cooperation. It has become more notorious for its infiltration, subversion, and sabotage attempts against other countries. It is imperative to unmask NED and alert all countries to the need to see through its true colors, guard against and fight back against its disruption and sabotage attempts, safeguard their national sovereignty, there's the word, security and development interests, and uphold world peace and development and international fairness and justice. Now, the report goes on to discuss a whole series of cases where NED has stuck its interventionist nose in other countries' affairs, right? It talks about Iran and hijacking the whole hijab affair in Iran a few years ago. Of course, it doesn't fail to mention Ukraine and Euromaidan, right? It doesn't fail to mention its interference in Serbian elections, even after two politicians there had been had been shot. Philippines, of course, Taiwan, right, supporting the Taiwanese independence forces, and with this idea of Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow, right, trying to link the two, right, that, they went after Ukraine, now they're going to go after Taiwan next, try to stoke up a China-Taiwan conflict, financed by the U.S. Hong Kong, right? Georgia, acting against the Foreign Agents Bill that the Georgian government did finally pass. And with all of that, it also mentions Mexico, which is what, of course, concerns us directly on this program, right? And it's very specific about it, right? See if we can find that here.
That's right here. Yep.
Okay, there it is, right? Taking Mexico as a major target country for infiltration. Okay, listen, right? Major target country for infiltration, which it is. Ned has supported organizations like Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity, MCCI, and the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, right? I think that's Luis Rubio over there, IMCO, right? And obstructed the electricity reform in Mexico. This is actually very interesting as well, because I've written about that in Jacobin. I wrote about that in Jacobin, right? While all of the U.S. media was talking about that, AMLO is a throwback to the 70s and he loves fossil fuels and he's against the greenwashing of multinational corporations trying to use the Mexican grid for their own, gain, right? Here's the real story. That the National Endowment for Democracy was involved in obstructing Mexico's electricity reform because it goes against the interest of U.S. multinationals. That's the real story. Nobody mentioned that in the U.S. Well, I did. I'm not trying to echar crema a mis tacos, but nobody else mentioned that at the time. Nobody, right? Yeah. Because all these things, follows, right? If you take something that's covert and make it overt, it's right there. It's hiding in plain sight. And if you've got as atrocious a media as the U.S. has, you can trust that they won't see it, right? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it follows, right? Like it makes me think of sort of the campaigns that always kind of precede regime change operations, right? Do you remember the 2019 coup in Bolivia? Before that, there was story after story about how he's not an environmentalist, about how he permitted the fires to get out of control. Yeah. Then a few years before that, there was a whole debate around the highway that, of course, they never followed up on, and that actually was resolved peacefully with the communities that were protesting at the time, right? It's always... And it always ties back to this. So around the issue around electricity reform, you're absolutely right. There was this effort to greenwash what is essentially sweetheart deals for private energy generating companies that were operating in Mexico that are funded by Spanish and U.S. capital. So it's not surprising that we'd see the soft arm of U.S. imperialism via the NED, via U.S. aid involved in this. Like I said, I was pretty surprised to see Mexico said as much, right? A major target for infiltration. Like it all makes sense, but it's somewhat comforting in a sense to be able to read this from a different part of the world that is obviously seeing the same patterns that we've been describing on this program. And I think it's really important to have that counter-hegemonic position from the Chinese and to say things, like even the language that they use, evil deeds. Right? Mm-hmm. I think it's really key. This is something that I've personally researched a lot. I did it in my master's around the weaponization, the instrumentalization of the discourse around democracy that's used by the United States when it comes to this, around trying to advance its imperialist interests by doing this. And I think Biden in particular, in contrast to Trump, really marked an aggressive strategy, right? You remember his summits for democracy that he held. I think there were two, one early in his term and one in the middle, talking about this concept. But obviously what it's actually being driven by is an interest in advancing the interests of U.S. capital, the owners of capital that are based in the United States, right? And the U.S. empire wanting to maintain its hold on the region. And I think it's very important that we're seeing this coming from the Chinese to understand that, this isn't some kind of tin foil hat conspiracy, right? This is actually what's happening. And it's important to speak out against it because we've talked about in the last program, if we're going to have a responsible adults in the room opposition, they can't be funded by the United States. That's not actually appropriate. And it's an infringement of sovereignty that we have to say no to. And if we do, as a population, enact laws to push back against that, which I think we should, then we should predictably expect them to accuse us of, like they did with Georgia, like they're doing with Venezuela, of wanting to silence dissent. But so the dissent funding by the U.S. Embassy is not legitimate, at least in my eyes.
Right. Very well said. And so, of course, as we know, the United States has FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act that you mentioned. The European Union has, its version of that, right? But when, a peripheral country like a Georgia, right, tries to enact something similar, boom, sanctions, right? And if Mexico were to try to strengthen its laws, as they should, and I've advocated for, just wait and see what the reaction you'd get, right? I think, the tiny country of Georgia has somewhere between 10 and 25,000, NGOs. Not all of them are active, but still it's an extraordinary number. Mexico has several thousand as well, right? We're not saying NGOs shouldn't operate, right, in Mexico. And, there are a lot of NGOs that do some valuable work, right? But, as we well know, and as we've documented, right, there are NGOs that are used by interests like the United States to, undercut, influence, and interfere in national country sovereignty, right? And they do it constantly, and they do it through reports. They do it through favorable media, right? They do it through all different kinds of lobbying and such, right? Which is why then, as the Chinese report pointed out, AMLO back in 2021, right, sent a diplomatic note about this, right? If you're going to act in the interest of a foreign country, it has to be open, and your financing has to be transparent, right? Not pretend otherwise, right? So AMLO sent this diplomatic note in 2021, got no response, right? Got no response, and just sent another one. This show comes out on Tuesday. He just sent it yesterday, Monday, right? He just sent another one yesterday, Monday, right? And laid out again what the problem with this is, right? That the United States government is constantly talking about, right? Cooperation and cooperation for development, right? And, respecting each other's, this and that and the other. So on top of what may have very well been a direct violation of some sovereignty with, the Mayo Zambada thing, whether U.S. agents entered directly into Mexican soil or not, we're still not sure, but, one can be highly suspicious. This is an ongoing violation of sovereignty, right? That has been flagged up. There's been no response, and they're doing it to this day. 3 years later to this day, another letter, right? Of course, the Mexican public is much more aware of it, but there it is. Right?
Yeah, I think AMLO's correct in calling it an interventionist attitude. So this is actually a headline from today. This is from today's Jornada on Monday, August 19th, where he talked about the letter that he published, that he sent to Joe Biden, expressing his inconformity with the financing by U.S. agencies of Mexicanos Contra la Corruption. We actually have the text of the letter here, shared by Jesus Ramirez Cuevas, where he talks about it. And we can look at it very quickly here, maybe translate the key parts, saying that, on this occasion, I am writing to you to let you know that for some time now, I have been denouncing publicly those who, from the United States government, have had an attitude that, from all appearances, appears interventionist to finance the activities that self-described Mexicanos Contra la Corruption and Impunidad is carrying out, whose principal objective is to attack our government, right? And so basically calling him out on it, right? Once again, signaling, like you said, repeatedly insisting that Mexican sovereignty be respected, that if you want to have a positive relationship with your southern neighbor, you can't be having people doing this kind of, as we just finished describing, or as the U.S., as the Chinese government described as evil deeds, funding basically the opponents of the government of the day. Would the United States tolerate that? I don't think so, right? And so why would that's the double standard? And I think it's important that he continue to use the avenues that are available, right? To say, here's a diplomatic note. We are unsatisfied with this kind of behavior. Improve, and then obviously, if they do nothing, which is likely what's going to be the outcome of it, then we can use the tools at our disposal to limit their ability to actually be funded by foreign organizations, and if they are, to actually provide transparency.
Now, some people will say, and you'd be right to say it, how patient must the Mexican government be, right? They flagged this up 3 years ago. There was no response. They're flagging it up again. The financing has continued. The interference has continued. Why not just kick them out? Why not just kick out USAID and NED from Mexico? And that's a very, that's a very legitimate point to make, right? You just have to, be careful about, we're talking about, the famous, evil empire here. Look what happened when AMLO limited the reach of the DEA, right, in Mexican soil. It became a multi-year campaign to undermine his government through, as we saw, ProPublica, the New York Times, all of these filterings from the DEA, right? The whole bot campaign during the campaign, narco AMLO, narco president, narco Claudia, right? So you just have to calculate it, right? He didn't even kick out the DEA. He just limited what the DEA and agencies can do in Mexican soil. And look at the campaign that was unleashed against it. I'm not saying be scared about it and be intimidated by it. I'm just saying weigh it in the balance. So if Mexico were to kick out USAID and kick out NED, of course there would be all sorts of covert, they'd step up the covert attempts to overthrow the government. So sometimes the calculus is let them do this stuff overtly and we're watching them, right? Because we know that that's going to go into covert activities if they don't, right? I'm not saying that's good. I'm saying that's the kind of calculus you have to make if you're a global South government dealing with interference from U.S. agencies, right? Yeah. Is it better to let them do it openly and you're monitoring it, or you kick them out and you watch them, funnel all that into covert undermining activities through other channels?
Mm-hmm.
Right? These are calculuses that you have to make all the time. That's all I'm saying here. Right?
And I think we're going to see more of this kind of interference as things progress in Mexico, as they continue to build on the progress that has been made thus far, which brings us to our next topic, which is the constitutional reforms. They are advancing. Can't stop, won't stop, as we said a couple of weeks back. And this is the big one. This is the major one. This is the one that's likely going to provoke a reaction from some of these same organizations who are going to decry the effect that it's going to have. We talked about that also. Some of the analysis claiming that, it's going to open the door to interference by organized crime groups and things like that. But the judicial reform is advancing. It's coming forward. So the Committee for Constitutional Reforms in the lower house, the House of Deputies, approved its resolution around this that includes more than 100 of the changes of the original initiative proposed by President Andrés López Obrador. Obviously, the big one, the one that gets all the headlines, is the election of judges, magistrates, and ministers of the Supreme Court. That will happen gradually, but it will happen. And this is the thing that had most worried, I think, some of the people who were wedded to or sympathetic to the old judicial system. They understand what I think it represents. I think in particular, people like Norma Pina, who's become the face of the resistance to the judicial reforms, sounding the alarms when it comes to this. But I think it means that the show is over for them. They're going to be on their way out. I guess she could run, right? She could put herself as a candidate, right? Sure. We'll see if the people vote for it. I doubt it. Mm-hmm. I really doubt it that she will even make it onto the short list when it comes to this. But I mean, that she's available, I would assume, to be able to present herself as a candidate for that. And so there you are. Obviously, a couple of other things that are important here. The number of ministers of the Supreme Court will drop from 11 to 9, as originally proposed. And the first ones will happen for periods of 8, 11, and 14 years in June of 2025. So relatively soon. We're talking about a year away, and where there will be the first elections to determine who will actually be part of the judicial branch of government. Finally, the branch of government that was never directly elected is now going to be elected. If you ask my personal opinion, I'm in favor. I think this represents yet again the deepening and the elimination of the barriers towards further progress, which is actually having a Supreme Court that is responsive to the demands of the majority of this population that wants to see the fourth transformation deepened and is tired of seeing that progress impeded by the judicial branch, as well as all of the acts of corruption and favoritism that, as we've seen documented previously, around the old political regime that exists in this country.
Yeah. So what we see in committee stage is they've made a few modifications to AMLO's original proposal. Kind of bowing to a little bit of pressure here, not changing anything essentially. But one of them that you mentioned is instead of electing all the judges, immediately staggering the elections, which makes sense because there's a lot of judges, and if people are going to have to elect judges both federally and they extend the reform to the state level, the state constitutions elect state judges as well, it's going to be a big change for voters. It's going to be a big change for voters here. To go from generally infrequent elections, right, every 3 years for Congress and then every 6 years for president, to now there is initiative and referendum in Mexico, right? There is also recall if you collect enough signatures. Add that to judicial elections, and you're creating a much more participatory democracy, right? At least procedurally, in a short time. So staggering those judicial elections makes sense, and they've also set up a technical committee to kind of filter the people who make it onto the ballot. But what I think is important is that if I understand it correctly, the Supreme Court's gone, right? That there's going to be an extraordinary election for the entire Supreme Court next year as part of that first round of the election. So no effing around, right? And as we see in the U.S. context, right? How many people would love that, right? No effing around, and no effing around in this,
especially when it comes to the Supreme Court. That is the number one conservative institution in the United States right now.
So what's interesting here is this is moving along. And even Ken Salazar, the U.S. ambassador, in a press conference a few days ago, came out sounding positive about it. So interestingly, the United States, I don't think the United States government supports this reform, but they're not openly opposing it. So again, it's what's the strategy? Salazar comes out and says, oh, well, I'm from Colorado, and in Colorado we elect justices, and I was involved in that process and whatever else. And I think it's good just so it doesn't go to the extreme of what it's like in Texas. It's like he sounded very, what's the word? I guess collaborative about it, right? Now, I don't think the United States government is, but they're obviously adopting the strategy of not going full on against it. Right, like we see in some other, international institutions and such, like that, the piece we read in Losers and Haters last week. Right. So it's a curious strategy there. Now, who is really opposing it, of course, are Norma Pena and her henchmen and women in the judicial branch, and they're trumping up a strike. José Luis, they're trumping up a strike, right? Tell us about that.
Well, so we have this news here that the workers from the judicial branch are announcing an indefinite strike. When they'll still be collecting their salary, of course.
Yes,
it's not one of those strikes where you have to, live off of strike pay. But they're going on strike in order to basically protect the status quo. Now, they will argue that their opinions weren't taken into consideration, that they've been forced into this position of having to go on to strike, of, kind of these last ditch efforts to try to stop this from happening. Of course, in the first place, we should say that this is an affront to the mandate that the Mexican population gave the government to pursue these reforms, to go through with them. They are part of the same system. Some of them may be great workers and have risen through the ranks. It's called their exámenes de competencia, which is a kind of basically, are they qualified to be there or not? Of course, there's also been lots of nepotism. A lot of family members tend to work in the judicial branch. So it seems like if you know somebody there, they can get you in. But that's not really what this is about, right? Like, this is about them protecting the status quo. This is about them feeling like this does represent an attack on them. Obviously, their alliances with the same defenders of the status quo, like Norma Pena, are clearly there. But here's an interesting thing that I saw in this article here, which is Ignacio Mir, who's the head of the Morena in the lower house of Congress, said that 60% of the changes that were made to the initial initiative that was presented by López Obrador way back in February were done as a result of the discussions that were held in the various fora around the judicial reform, and that many people from the judicial branch actually participated in this. So this idea that, we've been forced into this, no one's heard us, therefore we're going to have to go into a strike, I think is not one that really kind of holds up under any kind of scrutiny. What we're seeing here is patadas de ahogado, as we say in Spanish. I'm not sure what the translation is in English, but it's basically, the last grasp of straws by this interested party. There may be some who I'd suggest that the government of Mexico is somehow acting against the interests of workers because this is a strike and then they have to be listened to and things like that. But I would remind everybody that there were forums around the judicial branch held on the streets of this country. Open forums with the ministers of the court participating, experts, diputados, senators. There was a very concerted effort to get this out there, to have the population actually be aware of what was being proposed here. And what we're seeing here is actually a regressive attitude by the trade union leadership to try to protect the status quo. Essentially, it is a conservative position. No, we don't want to reform, even though we understand that most of society is really, upset with their experiences, as we've said many times as well. Anybody who has even the slightest bit of interaction with the justice system in this country leaves with a bitter taste in their mouth at best. And therefore, there is a clamor for this change. And I think that they would be wise to move out of the way because it's going forward. It's going to happen.
And that's why the joke doing the rounds in Mexico these days is, they say the judicial workers are going on strike. How can you tell? Okay. How are you going to tell? Right? Considering how slow and, unjust, Mexico's system is. If the judges were to go on strike, how could you tell? Right? I mean, really. To your point, this reform does not affect the actual workers in the judicial branch. It does not affect their salaries. It does not affect their benefits. It does not affect their advancement at all, despite scare tactics to the contrary, right? This is not a reform that goes after and attacks judicial workers, right? It's a reform that, goes after a staggeringly corrupt, set of judges who are on the take in a large number of cases. Right.
And of course, there's going to be the cleanup of the Consejo de Judicatura, which is also really important. It doesn't make sense. It's not really in line with international standards that the head of the Supreme Court is also the head of the body that is essentially responsible for discipline. So that one of the ways that you can clean things up is also by attending to that.
And, it's actually
judicial reform. It's moving forward.
And it's symbolically, just to close out on this topic, Norma Pina, back in her more arrogant days before the election, López Obrador showed up to a ceremony over there, and she notoriously did not stand up, right? Which is kind of, the standard, courtesy one makes when the president comes, whether you like him or her or not, right? So she didn't. She remained seated while, everybody around her was standing up, right? Just
including
to
other members of the Supreme Court, right?
That's right, right. So I'm not standing up for that guy. I'm not standing up for that guy, right? So Claudia Sheinbaum just got her constancia. She just got her certification as president-elect. The members of the Supreme Court was there. Guess who stood up? Norma Pina. Well, a little late now to stand up, actually. So, stand up all you want. And you can sit down and stand up 4 or 5 times. Somebody try to make up for the other one. But, a little late.
Oh, well, I wonder what she's going to do after it. She'll probably dive into politics. That's my
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised at all.
She's not very good at it. Yeah. I've been watching a lot of the interviews that she's been doing, right? She's not a very good communicator at all. But, hey, she's free to do it if she wants. Okay. Moving on to
she can get a fat salary at a U.S. sponsored NGO as well.
Oh yeah,
that's always if she wants to go the easier route,
or maybe be like a distinguished, chair of so and so at some right wing, faculty of law somewhere in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, isn't that what Cedillo does?
Yeah.
That's not the only constitutional reform moving forward. We wanted to touch on this and also just to remind everybody, because I don't think these are important. So what we saw, the same commission, the Committee for Constitutional Reforms in the lower house of Congress, approved the ban on GMO corn, which has been a pretty controversial topic because of the same reasons, right? There are U.S. interests, U.S. capital behind the export of GMO corn to Mexico. They see this as a threat to their livelihood, and therefore they've been putting pressure to stop that. It's been happening gradually, and some of that pressure actually resulted in a delaying of the implementation of this. But now this is, as you call it, the super law, the constitutional. There's no going around it, right? Nothing is above the Constitution. And even if they argue that this goes against NAFTA, nothing is above the Constitution. There can be a long debate about whether or not international treaties have that same kind of standing, but this is the highest law in the land, and it says that we are banning GMO corn. And of course, at the same time, really important as well, banning open pit mining,
Yeah.
which is one of the most damaging methods of mining. It totally scars the landscape. And if anybody's ever been near a mine, you'll know exactly what I mean. It's like tearing a hole into the skin of the earth. It's quite extraordinary, the impact that it does. So those have been banned. And fracking. Fracking as a method of extraction of natural gas, which basically involves injecting water, uses an extraordinary amount of water to break open the shale, which allows for the release of the gas, which is then collected and processed, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very damaging. It's actually one of the reasons that the U.S. has energy sovereignty is a dramatic expansion of fracking that happened in that country and that now made them a net exporter of hydrocarbons. But here in Mexico, because of the environmental impact, there we are again. López Obrador, he's not an environmentalist. He believes in supporting Pemex. Well, there you have it. What other country has banned fracking in its constitution? Obviously, it still needs to go through the process. But the fact when it makes it this far, it's pretty much a done deal.
Yeah, so this is important. We talked at length in the last episode about the reform to indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities, right? Which would allow them greater autonomy and a greater say as to the projects that take place, in their territories. So it would put more of a brake on mining activities in indigenous and Afro-Mexican territories. So that is now coupled with an overall ban nationally on open pit mining, right? Which is also devastating for waterways. So it also, goes into the other twin issue here of Mexico's water crisis, right? Yeah.
So it's good to see that. I think that's encouraging. Again, the line that I've been using, if this is what the second floor of the fourth transformation represents, I'm looking forward to see what else comes, because I think this is a very important step forward. And the kind of thing that maybe López Obrador wasn't in the position to do, because it was about kind of rescuing the Mexican state out of the throes of neoliberalism, but now we're talking about deepening. I think that's exciting.
Yeah, the question is really timing too in politics. One could argue that he tried to do these things, too early on. They might have just gotten blocked to the Supreme Court and all this. So he created the conditions where the supermajority could happen, and these can go through a lot easier, right?
Yeah.
So timing is very important in politics. Another important reform, which we're going to mention before we move on, in the framing of the energy reform, which is the Chinese Foreign Relations Ministry pointed out, National Endowment for Democracy was involved in blocking. It's going to be a lot harder for them to block it now because they are returning the Federal Electricity Commission to its status as a public organization, basically a parastatal, right, like Pemex, right, which has now the mission to operate in the public interest, right? Mm-hmm. Previous reforms, the neoliberal reforms, hadn't fully gotten rid of the Federal Electricity Commission. That would have been too obvious. But they turned it into a productive public enterprise, requiring it then to compete with, the private sector greenwashers and multinationals, right? Which is why the grid became, hybrid in Mexico, part public, part private. And then the Federal Electricity Commission was then required to buy private energy from these easily manipulable auctions, right, as exists in Spain, right, and other countries. Private auctions of energy that the Federal Electricity Commission was required to buy energy from. Mm-hmm. So this reform will now make the Federal Electricity Commission public once again and not subject to the same competitiveness rules that it would be as a productive enterprise. Right? And this goes along also with one of the other reforms of eliminating some of these autonomous executive agencies, which apply competitiveness rules in a very partial manner. Right. Yeah. For example, when AMLO acquired 12 power plants from Iberdrola, all of a sudden, boom, the Competitiveness Commission comes down on that. Right.
Yeah.
The Competitiveness Commission never came down on, monopolies in transport, monopolies of Cemex, monopolies on so many things in this country. They always let go by for years. But when there's something comes in the public interest, like acquiring these, power plants, there's the Competitiveness Commission there. Right. That's the problem with these autonomous agencies, which are, of course, captive organizations for elite interests. Right. So all that, getting rid of autonomous agencies and going along with the Federal Electricity Commission will go a long way towards paving what Sheinbaum sees as an energy tradition, but through public public institutions, right?
As it should be. There was that
Yeah.
great article before the election about how this actually makes a whole lot more sense. When you're talking about a green transition, it makes more sense that it be led by a public utility as opposed to trying to maybe entice private firms to do it, right? Let's not forget that the Supreme Court actually blocked one of the elements of the energy nationalization strategy because precisely, oh no, according to our legislation, competitiveness has to be protected. And as well, it's worth remembering when you read these headlines about in the future about how, the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, the state utility, lost money on this quarter yet again. Well, it's because it's a public utility. It's not meant to generate profits, right? It's meant to be a public service to ensure the electrification of the country. It's to ensure that businesses have a stable supply of energy always so that they can continue to expand their manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't necessarily have to turn a profit. This is the rejection of that neoliberal logic. So keep that in mind when you read stories about the Comisión. But speaking of the media, we want to move on to our final topic before the losers and haters.
Very quickly on this.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Very quickly on this, if you want to read more about this, Kate Aronoff had a good piece in the New Republic about how Sheinbaum energy transition can take place through public agencies and the public interest. And I think it was a very good analysis. So
I thought so. We'll put it in the description of the video so people can check out that article. So I think it makes a very good case, one that is infrequently aired in most private media outlets, especially those that are English language.
Almost never.
Yeah. It's very convincing to me anyway. Anyway, so I was saying, speaking of the media, speaking of their poor coverage, we had a very interesting case here. We'll let this roll, but what happened? I mean, it's not even clear what was going on when it comes to the case of Javier Corral, former governor of Chihuahua, being almost arrested by the anti-corruption police of the state of Chihuahua, which came all the way here to Mexico City to carry out this arrest. But what we're seeing here on the screen here are actually images of the attempted arrest by Imagen Noticias. And the first thing I thought when I saw this happen, because I happened to be online when it dropped, I was like, this is a weird story, is how did they get the tip? How did they know that this was going to happen? Were they really so lucky they happened to be at the restaurant where Corral was, where the arrest was going to take place? Very suspicious. But before we get to that, maybe you can fill us in. What's the backstory here? Who's Javier Corral? Who's Maru Campos? What does it have to do with this attempted arrest of the former governor of Chihuahua?
So Javier Corral, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, is the former governor of the northern state of Chihuahua, right? And a member of the PAN, the right-wing PAN party, right? But he's also been very involved in anti-corruption initiatives and has since jumped ship and has joined the Morena coalition, right? Which is, of course, heresy for panismo, right? Corral was won over by kind of the anti-corruption discourse and actions of AMLO and was convinced to join the Sheinbaum team, right? And is going to the Senate, right? If I'm not mistaken. Now, this goes back to something we've discussed a lot on this program as Morena's often unfortunate tendency to, accept too quickly figures from other parties, right? Chapulines, grasshoppers from other parties, right? Or, people who jump in from their parties, opportunists because they see how strong Morena is electorally. So they leave their party and, join Morena, right? In the worst cases, this can become a kind of gatto pardoismo, which is a very common phrase in Mexico, which comes from the famous Italian novel, The Gatto Pardo, right? Where the royalist all of a sudden becomes, a Republican when, Italy is changing its regime. So, he changes sides, at the very cleverly at the right time in order to maintain his position, right? So everything changes in order for nothing to change. Right. So this is very common, this gatto pardoismo in Mexico, right? Using that, I think, very apt literary reference. Right? I think it's Burt Lancaster in the movie, right? He's the gatto pardo in question, right? So you'll see this a lot of times that elite people will jump parties to the winning party, for things to change in order for nothing to change. Now, That's a problem, and that's a problem that Morena has to continue to face. Arguably, though, the Corral one is a good one for the coalition. This is arguably a good defection, right? Because Corral is from kind of the more reasonable wing of the PAN, right? He has shown a serious interest, not just a rhetorical one, in anti-corruption initiatives. And he's actually gone after he did when he was governor of Chihuahua, one of the most important scandals of the last decade, which is what was called Operación Zafiro, or Operation Sapphire, in which a predecessor governor of Chihuahua, Cesar Duarte, created a whole network of using state budgetary funds to finance the campaigns of PRI candidates, right? Using state budgets as their kitty, as their petty cash, right, to finance PRI campaigns. This is something that the left has denounced for decades in Mexico, the use of public funds to finance campaigns for the PRI and the PAN, right? And they brought case after case to the National Electoral Institute, all of which were summarily ignored. Or they said you have to go to the FEPADE, which is the organization which, was supposedly set up to prosecute electoral cases. Nothing ever happened. So if you want to understand why the National Electoral Institute is in such disrepute in Mexico, that's why. Because the left has spent decades denouncing exactly what Cesar Duarte did in Operation Sapphire, right? And nothing ever happened, right? All these dirty elections with public financing. Well, this time, Corral actually did go after this investigation, right? And Duarte went off on the lam, right? Went off to the U.S. The PRI is now in coalition with the PAN. So for all the more reason, Corral is considered a traitor to them.
Right.
Corral is considered very much a traitor to them. So what we saw here is it was a very staged moment, right? Very much along the lines of previous montages in Mexican media history, right? Previous montages like the Florence Cassé montage, right? The Sofia montage, right? The supposed girl into the Repsamen school, when the school came down in the 2017 earthquake. This use of Mexican media very tendentiously to create big, media setups, right? So the Ciro Gomez Leva, who is, a notorious right-wing, old school figure in Mexican media going back decades. AMLO just showed a video of him at the Mañanera a few days ago when he was harassing AMLO in this very aggressive interview at the time of the Desafuero in 2004, when AMLO was about to be stripped of his political immunity in order to be disqualified from running for the 2006 election, right? A younger Ciro Gomez Leva with more hair, right? Mm-hmm. Going after AMLO, then mayor of Mexico City. So just coincidentally, Ciro was right there. His cameras were right there. As the government of now Governor Maru Campos from the PAN, from Chihuahua, tried to arrest Corral in Mexico City. Right? But you can't. Because they're state charges. Right? So you can't arrest for state charges in another state unless you get a collaboration order. You get a collaboration order, a judicial collaboration order, right, requesting that the state in question, collaborate with your investigation and arrest the person in question. Because of course, otherwise, anyone could just jump state, right, and escape. Right. So that's not the point. The point is you have to go through the judicial process and get the collaboration order in order for your arrest warrant in your state to be valid in another state. Right. But there's more to it, isn't there, José Luis?
Well, that's precisely what didn't happen in this case. So there's there's the fact that Imagen TV was right there, Ciro Gomez Leiva's program. I think that tells you that this was clearly a plot that was hatched in Chihuahua by the government of Maru Campos. Now, the anti-corruption prosecutor is supposedly autonomous, but not really, of course, right? Like it's all appearances. And, carrying out this order to arrest him on, corruption charges that largely seem trumped up. We'll see how it plays out in the justice system. But it's not really to believe at face value. This does strike me as a case of political persecution. But then the way that they do things, I think, adds to that argument. So it turns out the anti-corruption police comes down from Chihuahua, arrives in Mexico City with a whole team of people to carry out the arrest. And like you said, they have to get permission because otherwise they're not operating their jurisdiction and actually are empowered to do that. They drop off the letter requesting collaboration minutes before they go and try to arrest Javier Corral. Obviously, the Mexico City Fiscalia, the Attorney General's office, received it and said, okay, we received it, but they did not take a decision yet. But they went ahead and tried to carry out the arrest as if they had received the go-ahead from this Mexico City Attorney General's office. And of course, Javier Corral, being a well-connected person, is able to get the acting Attorney General of Mexico City to actually come and intervene and try to clarify the situation. Here, Ulises Lara is the person in charge of the Attorney General's office, and he says this was an illegal action and therefore actually gets him out. Now, it's very important because there's this word that's been circulating, rescate, rescue, right? This is actually the language that Ciro uses in this tweet here. He would rescue you from being detained. It was not a rescue. It's not like he came and stole him out of handcuffs and put him into his van. What he said is that you're not allowed to do this, and until we process it, you're not allowed to carry it out. Therefore, we have to protect the freedom of this Mexican citizen, which is absolutely the correct thing to do. And of course, now it's been a war of words between the anti-corruption police of Chihuahua and the Attorney General's office of Mexico City. According to the Chihuahua anti-corruption police, he is a prófugo de justicia. So he's on the lam. But Mexico City, obviously, with everything that having gone on, is now really looking into whether or not they are going to collaborate with this. Would they make themselves part and parcel of what is essentially a political campaign to try to enact some kind of revenge on Javier Corral for precisely what you said? For one, actually following through on anti-corruption practices, and two, being seen as a traitor to panismo, to prianismo, and all this. Right. Javier Corral has his own long letter here, basically in response to everything that happened. This was published the following morning after everything went down. But he actually says here he's actually filed an official complaint against the governor of Chihuahua, Maria Eugenia Campos Galvan, and the state anti-corruption priest, Luis Abelardo Valenzuela Holguín, and whoever else was responsible for trying to do this, what she calls an abuse of authority, illegal detention, and the rest of it, right? So, and here he explains his point of view, right? And he says here the state authorities of Chihuahua tried to detain me arbitrarily out of any kind of legal process because they did not have the authorization. He explains the political background behind this, right? Basically what we just heard from Kurt here, talking about the reasons why we may see this kind of reprisal from the governor of Chihuahua against one of her predecessors, right? And he obviously professes his innocence, and he says he wants to defend himself on freedom, as is his right. And he says here, and I think this is important, if in Chihuahua, the judicial system, the institutions of the judicial system were not taken over by the governor, who at the same time is under the control of Cesar Duarte, the former governor, and Manilio Fabio Beltrones, a pre-senator, although he's been kicked out of the pre for not being loyal enough, he would be able to, but obviously he's going to face what he accuses of being an unfair process, right? And so where do we go from here, though? I'm not sure what happens next. I think, it's a pretty serious thing to be considered to be on the run from the law. What are the next steps for him? Or is he just going to wait until he gets into his immunity as a senator and then try to ride out this process?
Now, it's interesting that he mentions there Manlio Fabio Beltrones, right? Known in the Mexican political world as Don Beltrone, right? For being very much a mafioso figure. Beltrones is from Sonora, right? Nearby there. And is heading back to the Senate after being very quiet, curiously quiet throughout AMLO's term, right? He's just been kicked out of the PRI bancada, So he's no longer officially a PRI senator. So he's kind of a floating radical there, right? Corral accuses him of being behind this whole, controlling Mario Campos and being behind this whole thing. And it's no coincidence that he's a big buddy of Ciro Gomez Leiva, right? They're big buddies, right? They're big buddies, right? So very likely he was the one who, kind of coordinated the whole thing so that Gomez Leiva's cameras could be there at that time. And watch out for Beltrones because he is a mafioso figure. And rumor has it, and it's just rumor at this point, that he's going to be trying to create a grouping of independent senators, in the Senate because he's been kicked out of the PRI, grouping in the Senate. And he's going to try to peel off some of the other former PRI senators that have been elected from other parties, right? One of the rumors is Alejandro Murat, the former governor of Oaxaca, PRI, who was elected as a senator for Morena on the party list system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Terrible that Murat, is representing Morena in the Senate. There you are. So the idea would be that Beltrones is trying to peel off some of these former PRI senators from different parties to create an independent grouping and make it all the more difficult that the constitutional reforms pass, right? Because they're just two or three senators short in the Senate. Let's see if that happens. But that is what it is rumored that Don Beltroni is trying to do in the Senate, in addition to whatever he's doing with Mario Campos and Chihuahua and Javier Corral.
It makes sense. It makes sense that he's trying to position himself as a power broker because of that 2-seat gap between having the supermajority. There's going to be this effort to try to use that to, extract concessions out of the government to make some kind of deal and things like that. We'll see, because there are other factors when it comes to the Senate, right? There's also Movimiento Ciudadano, which is trying to present itself as progressive. And I think they would be embarrassed publicly if they refuse to support some of these constitutional reforms, like the ones we've just talked about on this program, right? Banning fracking, banning open pit mining. That's the kind of thing, that's what they've been trying to portray themselves as opponents of, right? So it would be embarrassing for them to not vote in favor of these constitutional reforms. And they have 5 seats, if I'm not mistaken, in the Senate, which would give them enough, together with Morena and its allies, the supermajority. So, I'm not surprised he's making that move, but I don't think it's going to work out for him too well. And like you said, he's got a long history here. I'm not sure if people want to be associated with him. There's a reason why Alito Moreno.
That's true too, yeah.
So we run a little bit long, so we're going to do this last segment really quick. I apologize for our friends who love this segment here, but it's kind of an easy target. Andrés Oppenheimer, every time he opens his mouth, he says something stupid. He's not somebody who I think should be taken seriously, but these ideas circulate. Where do they circulate? Miami Herald, that sort of right-wing Latin American migrant community, mostly Cubans, some Venezuelans, but also, there's probably some right-wing Mexicans also living there as well, although their kind of base of operations tends to be more Madrid than it is Miami. But these ideas are out there. These circulate amongst the right wing. And here you are. He's calling them excuses for inviting Putin and Maduro. Before we get into the actual text of it, Mexico historically has an independent, sovereign foreign policy, non-interference. It's in the Constitution. We talked about this before. But also, because of that, has good relations with most of the world. And it actually helps play a positive role in international relations. And of course, anybody that Mexico has diplomatic relations with is invited to the inauguration. That's diplomatic protocol. Ecuador isn't invited. Peru isn't invited. But there are reasons for that, because there isn't open, clear diplomatic relations with these countries. With Venezuela, there is. With Russia, there is. So, of course, they're going to be invited. And apparently, that's not a good enough argument for Mr. Oppenheimer.
Well, it's just so dumb, right? It's just so dumb. And they've been trying to play this up with very little success over the last few weeks in Mexican media that, Sheinbaum's inviting Putin, right? Putin and Putin alone, right? And ignoring the obvious fact that you mentioned that they invite everyone which they have clear and open diplomatic relations with, right? So here we have, right, these just these antiquated fossil pundits, right? Just these fossil pundits that make, ridiculous amounts of money to just rehash their bilge at the beginning of every term. So you have, Oppenheimer here playing to his, Miami public basically saying it doesn't add up because Mexico has relations with Peru, but they're not inviting the president of Peru. Well, actually Peru withdrew their ambassador from Mexico. Peru did that.
Yep.
Peru did that, right? With the Boluarte regime there, right? Ecuador, we know exactly what happened, right? Noboa invaded the Mexican embassy, right? Everybody else who has diplomatic relations are getting invited. Unfortunately, Israel is being invited, right? Because Mexico has diplomatic relations with Israel.
That's actually, for me, the bigger scandal. I wish that was the headline. Why are we inviting a country that's committing genocide? That is far more worrisome.
And so what's interesting is, being a student of dumb media on Mexico, I dug up Oppenheimer's column from the last time when AMLO was about to be inaugurated, right?
Yeah.
2018. Said the exact same thing. Right? AMLO's starting off on the wrong foot because he invited Maduro, who came, and is probably going to come this time. Right? Said the exact same thing. It's funny that the piece doesn't age well. If you read the piece now, it says things like AMLO's approval rating has fallen from 65% in August to 56% in November. Right? We're talking about 2018 here. AMLO's approval rating is about 80% now. Right?
Yep.
Because he's made a series of mistakes, even before taking office, with regards to canceling the airport, right, and appointing nationalists to key positions, right? But the worst mistake is inviting Maduro. You see how poorly this aged?
Quite literally the same exact argument.
It's the same exact thing, right? But these people who have no analytical skills and obviously no personal dignity, right? Because they just, pundits on the take, have no problem in looking back at their old, column from 2018, same period, a couple months before the inauguration, and saying, I was wrong last time. Fuck it, I'll repeat it. So they just do a copy-paste. They just do a copy-paste of the same exact argument, the same exact BS, the same exact misleading nonsense to try to red bait. Right?
And of course,
that's
the same old names, right?
Yeah.
Jorge Castañeda. That's the only person quoted.
My God. My God. Man has been so thoroughly discredited during this campaign, right? For saying that Xochitl Gálvez should go negative, per the U.S. playbook. And she did it, listening to him, and her campaign tanked.
Yeah.
Right? So congratulations on listening to Castañeda on anything. Right? It's extraordinary. They're living in 1985. Not even. Right?
He doesn't even get simple, he doesn't even understand how these international law institutions work, right? Unlike Putin, Maduro is under investigation, but has not been convicted. The ICC has not convicted Putin either. It has issued from the bench an arrest warrant. Maduro also faces the potential for it, right? But nobody has been convicted by the ICC, neither Putin nor Maduro, and Maduro doesn't even have an arrest warrant out for him, based on a regime change strategy of the Lima group that he talked about in the 2018 column here, right? Tried to push in the ICC to further smear Venezuela and Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution, right? Anyway, there you have it. Losers and haters, as usual.
And recyclers.
Maybe we should update the name of the segment. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of another program here. As always, it's a good thing we're doing weekly shows because there's always something coming up. I've been really happy to be able to share with you, in particular, all the advances that have been made when it comes to the constitutional reforms. I think it's really exciting. When I saw that around fracking, around open pit mining, right? These are long-standing demands from environmentalists, from land defenders in this country, really building on an important progressive agenda. I think it's important to always respond to those critics who always try to say that, no, there's nothing progressive about this, right? And so to see that things are advancing in the interests of humanity. We're not just talking about the Mexican working class, but humanity as a whole. And so I'm encouraged that, especially in the times we're living in, right, where there seems to be a shift to the right, where there seems to be rising fascism, where there is instability throughout the world. It is comforting to know. We didn't really talk about it in this program, but I've been really, really pleased with López Obrador's foreign policy when it comes to Venezuela. Unlike Colombia's Petro, unlike Brazil's Lula, which has floated ridiculous proposals out there about redoing the elections or coalition governments. It's absurd. Mexico has been right on this one, saying, no, respect Venezuelan institutions. Let's see what the Supreme Court says when it comes to their analysis of the results. That is what a good neighbor does. And I'm glad that I live in a country ruled by a party, by a movement that prioritizes Soberanía.
My name is Kurt Hackbarth. A shout out to everyone in Chicago who's protesting the Gaza genocide on the streets and in the convention this week. We're with you. And the college protesters when the semester gets started. We'll join you next week for another episode of Soberanía.